Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this third meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Infrastructure, third meeting in this calendar year. My name is Andrew Jones, MP for Harrogate and Knaresborough, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Appgi and will be chairing this morning's discussion. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're at a very interesting moment because we're just at the point where a significant amount of government announcements, perhaps delayed a little bit through the challenges of the last 18 months, but we're about to face a huge policy-heavy period. We're expecting the integrated rail plan, the union connectivity review. We've seen the announcements yesterday on net zero. We're going to be hearing more about levelling up. We have the budget next week. We have the heat and building strategy. We've got to respond to the NIC, Commissions on Infrastructure. We've got the Environment Bill. The government has announced it's going to be spending £650 billion of public and private investment in infrastructure for the next 10 years. That is a policy-heavy agenda. It's a very exciting agenda too. So we're having a discussion today really about what we want to see during the course of this period ahead. And it's great, therefore, to be joined by three eminent speakers. I need to just perhaps inform you, first of all, we have one policy speaker change. Polly Billingham is unwell, but we're being joined by Jonathan Spruce. Jonathan is an incoming trustee for ICE and is former director of Transport for the North. Thank you, Jonathan, for doing that. We're also being joined by James Heath. James is the Chief Executive Officer for the National Infrastructure Commission, having previously been at DCMS and the BBC, and Alistair Reiner from CECA, Civil Engineering Constructors Association, basically speaking on behalf of a huge and powerful body who have to deliver all of the aspirations of our nation. No pressure for that sector. So I'll be coming to each of you to talk a little bit about what you're hoping to see and why in the period ahead. I'm going to come to, if I may, perhaps James, I can come to you first. The question we have is, just to get our discussion going, what one thing, from an infrastructure perspective, of course, must the spending review or the budget or all the other announcements that we're expecting, what one thing must they deliver and why? James, over to you, please.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a that's a big question, given as you said, the very policy heavy agenda in infrastructure. If you'll indulge me a little bit, I may, before I answer your question, which I will, I may just give you a little bit of a preamble, if that's okay, to put it into context.
Of course it is.
But I will answer the question. So I think the first thing to say is that we do already know quite a lot about the shape of infrastructure policy and funding, at least for the next 3 years in many areas of infrastructure policy. And I think we've got to see the coming budget and spending review in that context. Of course, the Treasury could change the plans that it set for infrastructure only a year ago in terms of capital. But I think the broad parameters are fairly clear. And we obviously also have the National Infrastructure Strategy last year, which set out the government's long-term position. And we actually regarded that as a positive step towards developing a much more joined-up strategic approach to long-term infrastructure planning. And it's something that we called for. And in fact, that infrastructure strategy was largely a response to the Commission's first National Infrastructure Assessment back in 2018. And it was good to see a number of the ideas that we proposed being turned into policy. So the idea of phasing out petrol cars and vans in 2030, setting up the infrastructure bank, the looking at placing a strategic bet on hydrogen, and also actually raising the profile of design and evidence in terms of how I think about infrastructure. And on the money, again, we know quite a bit. Certainly the government is spending this year about 27 billion on economic infrastructure. That's around 1.2% of GDP, which again is in line with the fiscal remit that the Commission has. and is in line with what we've previously recommended. And as I said, on flood defences, on broadband, on roads, on rail, the next 3 years capital envelopes are reasonably clear. I mean, of course, they may be tweaked next week, but I think we've got a reasonably good sense of quantum and direction in those sort of areas. So for me, then, the two priorities, or the two sort of gaps, if you like, where I think we need to see greater progress. One is around turning policy goals into delivery plans. I think the ambitions on regional growth, levelling up, and net zero now really do need to be underpinned by specific policy levers, by specific delivery plans, and by appropriate funding. And we are, as Andrew said, we started to see progress on this. I mean, we've just seen a huge weight of documents published yesterday on heating and building strategy, on net zero strategy. We're still wading through those, but they're ambitious documents. And a couple of 2 or 3, 4 weeks ago, can't quite remember, given the pace of things, we had the hydrogen strategy out as well, which set a direction there. So it's how we take those policy goals and ambitions and turn them into policy plans and delivery. I think is a really important challenge. And then I suppose the second big challenge is where we are on policy and funding devolution in England around infrastructure. And I think it's a sort of house view of the Commission that if we are going to change the economic geography of the country and use infrastructure as a tool to do it, we have got to see a greater move towards powers and funding being devolved to towns and cities, so they can actually develop their local infrastructure plans in line with local needs and make them part of wider economic strategies. Because clearly infrastructure is only one tool in terms of regeneration. Skills, education, planning are equally important. And then making sure there's the capacity at the local level to actually develop and deliver those plans. I think we need to see that across sort of towns and cities, which sort of gets me to, if you like, my one specific policy proposal I would like to see, and that's on the integrated rail plan in the spending review in the budget. We did a major piece of work on rail needs for the North and the Midlands to advise the government on the IRP, and I think getting the IRP out next week just provide real golden opportunity, I think, for government to bring sort of clarity and stability and pragmatism to future rail planning, and move away from the sort of stop-start model and the mistakes of the past, and actually set out a clear funded plan for rail in the North and the Midlands that will provide confidence both to public and private investors that they can come behind and invest around. So that would be my one particular thing I would like to see. I think it's now overdue. And I'll stop there.
Well, James, thank you very much. Very interesting. I think we do know quite a bit. I'm still wading through the documents from yesterday too. I expect everybody still is. There's a limit to how much you can read in one day. But there is the direction I think is fairly clear, though you can see there are pressures. And we get a little glimpse of some of these things. The government is clearly facing a radically changed financial situation from 2 years ago. This will be affecting revenue more than capital. But the government must have at least £600 billion less than anticipated during the course of this financial year, just compared to only 2 years ago. So that is an astonishing change in terms of extra borrowing, support through the pandemic, and an ongoing cost which will be higher. So any organisation with £500 billion of difference is not going to say it's business as usual, which is why I think we will be seeing a focus upon prioritisation. Interesting to hear your points about the IRP. I thought you might mention something about digital, looking at your very digital background. And I think power generation also might be creeping up the agenda. But let's leave this for our discussion a bit later. Jonathan, can I come to you next, please? Your thoughts, preamble, and answer to that question as well will be very interesting. So over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I mean, James is right, and devolution is a big issue. You'd expect somebody who's lived and worked in the north of England for all of his life to pick that one up. I think that would definitely be the one. But I think if I had to pick one thing, Andrew, right this moment in time, it's to take James's last point and move it on a bit. I think I'd look for a realistic and lasting settlement for our public transport system. the COVID-19 pandemic has shown our ability to reallocate road space to sustainable modes like active travel. But I think we're in real danger at this moment in time of a car-led recovery. And you can see that with the volume of vehicles and the recovery in car traffic from pre-pandemic as opposed to rail and bus. And there is really absolutely no credible route to net zero without a thriving, flourishing public transport system that needs proper funding, both capital and revenue, over the short, medium and long terms. So I think that realistic and lasting settlement and a direction of travel signalled on that, partly, as James said, through the integrated rail plan. We've all heard the rumours about HS2 East and whether it will be delayed, kicked in the long grass, cancelled or whatever. But even if it is, sadly, there are still things that need to be done on the network, like connecting Leeds and Sheffield, for example. That was a key part of HS2 East. And anybody who does that journey regularly, as I do, knows, that two great cities, so, like sort of 30, 35 miles apart, where you've got, a 40-minute train journey on a 4-carriage cross-country service is not how you want to be connecting the great cities of the north or of England and the UK. And Andrew, you'll know as well that the East Coast Main Line, north of sort of York, and the pressures there, but how vital that section is for the north of England. And its connections to Scotland, back to the Union Connectivity Review there as well. So the IRP, I think, is critical. Buses, absolutely. The National Bus Strategy was a good start, but we need to see the role of buses and quality buses and new types of buses like demand responsive transport in the future. Andrew, you'll know the 36 and the success has been on a quality service. But that's often seen as the exception and held up as this virtuous way to do it. I think we need to see services like the 36 and like the work that's been done in Brighton and Hove and Bristol as the norm rather than the exception. We hold those sort of services up as shining beacons. That needs to be the level we aspire to across all of our urban areas, and then in our rural areas connecting it differently. And then in things like light rail, it seems really strange, I think, that some of our new light rail systems in sort of Manchester and Sheffield are actually approaching life expiry. They're almost 30 years old now in terms of delivery. So I think how we plan to renew our light rail systems and build on them using things like tram train technology and that better integration with our local services, which will be done probably through better devolution and more local control, I think is important. But all of that requires that realistic and lasting settlement for public transport. I think the IRP kicks it off, but I think it only does that, Andrew. It should just kick it off. I think then it is, what does that mean in practice on the ground in our key urban centres?
Interesting. I do indeed know the 36. I have a very fond view of the 36, which is, for those who don't know, a bus that operates in North Yorkshire connecting Ripon, Harrogate and Leeds, and it's very good. Right, plenty to think about there. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Interesting that you are in quite similar territory to your thinking as James here. Let me go next over to Alistair. Alistair Reisner, thank you very much for joining us. Alistair, Civil Engineering Contracting Association, over to you, please.
So I think if the question is what's the one thing from an infrastructure spending perspective we would want to see at the spending review, look, we are brazenly, nakedly, unashamedly a lobbying organisation. I'm not going to pretend we're anything other than that. So you would expect ahead of a major financial statement, we would be doing a massive push on here's a big long list of shopping list of things that we want you to spend money on. We're much more pragmatic than that. I remember sitting in my car in March. I had to sit in my car because we had poor broadband in my house. And it's amazing how the world changes when suddenly you can't get access to Zoom and Teams. And so I was listening to financials, the Chancellor's statement and the coronavirus job retention scheme, that intervention. And my first thought was to collect my jaw off the floor about the scale of ambition of that intervention. My second thought was, at some point, we're going to have to pay for this. And I think that's where we are. We're at the point now where the financial interventions for COVID means that there is very little headroom for new expenditure. So as industry, we've not been campaigning for new investment. We have recognised the world that we're in. So instead, our view is really the autumn budget, the spending review must be about sustaining what we're already delivering and using what limited funds we have available much more effectively. So I think both of our previous speakers have talked about devolution, and I think we're very keen on ensuring that where devolution is happening, those organizations actually have the ability to spend the money that's provided to them effectively. And that is, to me, about giving them longer term certainty around that funding. So giving them 5 years rather than giving piecemeal funding, particularly on a competitive basis. From an industry perspective, we've got to be ready for that investment. So it's not all about what we want from the government, it's about what we should be doing ourselves. So I think for us, the responsibility is about investing in skills and making sure that we're driving a vast increase in the number of apprenticeships and other new entrants into our industry. So that's sort of where we are, but I think that hasn't really answered the question. So for me, the one thing that I think we want to see from the spending review in the autumn budget is actually confidence and trust, because this government was elected on the basis of a manifesto. Obviously, COVID has very much shaken things up, but I still think some of the themes in that manifesto stand today. I think we can all agree that Get Brexit Done has been done. I don't think there's anyone that disagrees that we have left the EU. However, around net zero and levelling up, there are some big commitments there. I have reasonable confidence that we're on the right track around net zero. Around levelling up, I'm less sure. I want to see at the spending review much more clarity about what levelling up really means. I know there's no new money, but it does feel like a promise was made to the regions of the UK, particularly the North. I say this as a proud Northeasterner. I'm worried that levelling up won't mean very much in infrastructure terms when we come to the end of this Parliament, in terms of actual transformational change in the regions, and particularly the Northeast. I was sitting having my breakfast this morning and trying to think of what the last transformational transport project was in the Northeast, and I came up with it was probably the Tyne and Wear Metro. I went to go to the Tyne and Wear Metro shortly after it was opened. I was 3 years old. So I could be wrong. I'm sure someone will tell me actually there's been a transformational transport project in the Northeast since then. I'm happy to. I'm all ears as to what it has been. We do have the opportunity around the widening of the A1 north of Newcastle that might come up, but you know, that's another scheme that's been 30 odd years in the pipeline. So for me, I would love to see that spending review gives a great deal more clarity on what levelling up will really mean in terms of changing people's lives around the UK.
Alistair, thank you very much. I also was taken to see the Metro when it opened. I was doing a geography O-level, maybe A-level at that point, and it was a school trip. And that wasn't quite so recently. So I think that is a fair comment. But nevertheless, an exciting thing. They're renewing their rolling stock at the moment. Well, 3 fascinating and very thought-provoking starts to our discussion. Let's now open it up for comments and questions. Please indicate just simply by using the hands up facility if you want to ask a question or make a comment. I can't see where they are at the moment, but there are some others wishing to help with this. And I've got some others in the monitoring the questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, now is your chance to put your hand up to do so. Whilst people are thinking about what to ask, can I perhaps come in with a first question? Confidence, funding, certainty, devolution. There were some themes there, which I think if you draw a Venn diagram across the 3 contributions, there would be area in common. It's very easy to make points that I've not got enough money, I'm in charge of a big city, I haven't got enough money because those nasty people in Westminster don't give me any money. Devolution of spending or devolution of raising money. I'm quite sure that devolution is a really significant part of the answer to owning your own future, shaping a local solution to a local problem. But if this is just simply going to be money passing from Westminster to cities, or are we thinking about a bit more of a fiscal devolution as well? That's not a straightforward matter to deal with, more perhaps a politician's question than an infrastructure question. But James, you mentioned it. Is it something that you've had any thoughts upon?
Andrew, I think you raise a very good point there. I mean, we published a piece of work on sort of towns regeneration infrastructure a sort of month or so ago, where we made the case for not if you like, not a bigger quantum of money, but a different funding model, i.e. move away from sort of multiple competitions to consolidated funding, but actually move the accountability to the local level. So the accountability has got to flow with the money, and actually you require local leaders to set out clear, transparent plans, which they're held accountable to, and they flow through into the following funding settlement. So I agree that the accountability has got to go with the money. You raise an interesting question about, is there a scope for greater raising of local finance? Certainly when we did some work previously on major interventions in mass transit systems in cities, and we talked about significant investment need, we did talk about a joint funding model, and around 20% of that funding would need to flow from locally raised finance. And that's clearly easier in some places than in others. But I agree, it can't just be a conveyor belt of sort of money from the centre flowing out to local areas. About A, accountability, and B, proper structures and capacity in place to ensure that money is spent effectively, and also to consider the issue of local finance as well. So I think it's got to be part of a new model, not just one part of funding.
Interesting. I think it has to be seen in the broader context. I think you're absolutely right. An important rule, I think, is to operate a system where you have an alignment of accountability and responsibility. You will get significantly better delivery, focus, etc. People see it in their own private lives in terms of the businesses they work with. The same applies most certainly in politics, but we usually forget it more in politics than we do in business. Right, hands are going up. Can I come first of all, please, to Lord Bradshaw, and then I'm going to come to John Kavanagh after that. So Lord Bradshaw first, please, John Kavanagh second. Lord Bradshaw, I can see you're there with a hand up, but you are on mute at the moment.
Pressing on mute as hard as I can. Is it all right? Right. It's a particular problem, but I think it does give me great unease about government policy, and I'm going to refer to the problem with HGV drivers. It appears to be affecting large sections of the economy. I was party about 2 years ago in giving the rail minister a list of small infill railway electrification schemes aimed at two things: alleviating the need for heavy goods vehicles and obviously saving fuel. Nothing has been done about this, and yet an enormous amount of effort, some of it wasted, has been diverted to recruiting more heavy goods vehicle drivers, possibly without thinking what a rotten job it is and why people won't do it, where first of all you could make the job better, although that will be very expensive, but also look for alternative ways of shipping goods which can be done within almost within the confines of existing railway network.
Well, interesting point, quite wide-ranging point there about how we can effectively minimize the need for transmission of freight on roads by getting more of it onto our railways. And we clearly do have a major problem with HGV drivers, and that's been brewing, I suspect, for much longer than just this pandemic. I think it's been brewing for several years. I don't know if anybody wishes to come in to comment upon that. Perhaps Jonathan, from your strategic perspective from TFN, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. Lord Bradshaw, you're quite right, and I think that this is a sort of legacy of the siloed thinking as well that we often go in. That the Network Rail, for example, have a freight strategy. You know, well, why is freight different for passengers? Because you're sharing the same sort of mix of lines. So I think this is where the integrated rail plan, as James alluded to and I mentioned as well, and Andrew picked up before, becomes really, really important, because you are using the same infrastructure for different needs, and how we best use that fixed set of infrastructure for a wide range of needs is a decision we need to take, and a long-term view we need to take as well. And there are certain times of day when the network is quieter, which we can use it, and there are certain routes where you could improve connectivity and have freight diversions. So, for example, Alistair will know the Leamside line in the northeast. The reopening of the Leamside line relieves passengers and freight on the East Coast Main Line. And also, you've got the Durham coastline as well. So you've got 3 rail lines going north-south, which can serve different purposes at different times. But we don't plan it like that. We don't plan it as a system. We plan it as passengers or freight or electrification. And I think that sort of integrated look at the system is what we need. So if we are going to have an increased demand for goods, so back to the pandemic and how the increase in sort of internet shopping and home deliveries has happened, that increase in goods is only going to carry on beyond where we are now. So coming up with a long-term system solution to it, I think is where we need to get to, driven by, as you said, that short-term issue about HGV drivers.
Thank you. Alistair, do you want to come in and make a couple of comments here?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our perspective, that shift onto rail it's the right thing for carbon. It's the right thing for reducing transport on the road network. It's the right thing for addressing some of the skill shortages that we've seen more recently. Look, as construction, we're doing everything we can to get construction materials, which is one of the large categories of materials moved around the road network, onto rail, because it's just productive. At the moment, it's quite difficult because there aren't those rail connections in some cases. So it just becomes it's less economical. It's just not possible to move construction materials to certain parts of the country using the rail network. And obviously you need investment in railheads and things like that in order to bring the material off. But no, we would be extremely supportive of this, but it is not an overnight fix. And I think one of the other problems with this is, if I was being blunt, it's not very sexy, it's not in the news, and so there's less sort of groundswell of support around investing in these schemes that actually make a massive difference. So we probably need to articulate the case for this beyond the sort of the rail freight world to the public and get them to understand this, because then that'll build the consent for some of these important schemes to go ahead.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point. You do have to take people with you, that is more easily done in some areas than others. So you have to make your case in a long-term, sustained, nuanced way, but you always have to win your arguments.
Yeah.
Right. Can I come next to John Kavanagh, and then I'll go to Kate Martin-Kober after John, please. John, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So yesterday's net zero strategy set out plans to leverage £90 billion in private investment by 2030 to hit net zero targets in the UK. So what role does the panel see for private investment in infrastructure in achieving net zero, and what role can strong policy and regulatory frameworks play in that by driving down the cost of capital and providing extra certainty for private capital investing? Thank you.
Right. Well, that could go, I think, to any of our speakers. Perhaps I could come to you first, James.
Thank you. Look, that really is an important question. I think that clearly getting to net zero is going to require huge amounts of investment, both to decarbonise existing infrastructure networks, but also to build new ones like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. And I think that the overwhelming majority of that funding is going to come from the private sector, which raises I suppose a couple of questions. I think they're genuine. Clearly, the investment, when I say private sector, the investment will ultimately need to be funded by either consumers, i.e. bill payers, or taxpayers. And I think one of the questions which hasn't been resolved yet is the overall affordability of the required investment, the distribution of those costs and savings across groups of society, and who's going to pay for them. So I think there's a big who pays question, which is still looming across this whole debate on net zero, which I'm not sure the Treasury's proposals yesterday fully answered. It's very hard, but it's a big question, and we're going to look at it further in some of our work. I think in terms of the sort of private sector consumer investment side, you're absolutely right, John, that the way you're going to attract that investment in at scale is to ensure that there are appropriate rates of returns for investors, and to ensure that the regulatory models are sort of pro-investment. And that's why, whether it's hydrogen or carbon capture and storage or whatever area it is, building those financing and regulatory, or indeed nuclear, those financing and regulatory models to provide greater sort of demand certainty and reduce risk is absolutely central to that wall of private sector investment coming in. So I sort of totally agree with you. In any of the areas you pick, particularly in the energy space, the sort of technology innovation question is one part of it, but the second big part of it are the regulatory and financing models to incentivize that scale investment and sort of de-risk it. And we could go into any of those particular verticals, happy to do so about what some of the areas might be. But I also think we shouldn't miss that higher question, the political economy question, about the right balance of funding between consumers, bill payers and taxpayers, and how that's going to be distributed across the different parts of the net zero agenda, which is a huge question.
Alistair, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I would probably share and reflect James's view that, if I've understood it correctly, that in essence, the private sector will probably be responsible for the majority of the investment in this space, with the public sector only really stepping in where things are genuinely not investable for whatever reason, but need to be done. In our world, as infrastructure, clearly some of those big investments will be around generation, and particularly new nuclear, things like that. So it's about putting in place a policy framework that allows that to happen. And if the last 20 years has told us anything, that is not easy. But I think the carbon case for this is now unstoppable. We just need to get to a situation where we can deliver low carbon generation capacity, not just in nuclear, but across renewables as well. I think the other big area of opportunity where the private sector will play a huge role is in domestic retrofit. We have this existing housing stock across the whole of the UK. To be blunt, the government isn't going to pay to upgrade those homes. It will be for the homeowners, probably supported by financing, to do that work. So again, it's about what is the policy framework going to be that allows that to happen at pace, because you're talking about huge volumes of the figures about how many homes you would need to do a week are terrifying, and yet we're almost not even starting that journey yet. And so for me, the warning from history there goes back to the Green Deal and the government setting out we're going to go hell for leather about this and then changing its mind. The private sector, the one thing it can't deal with is rapid policy shifts that mean business cases to develop some of this work suddenly fall apart. So I suppose the big thing we need to have is a policy framework that encourages private sector investment, because if we do then have to fall back on public sector investment, we know that that's not going to happen at the pace we need to deliver net zero carbon by 2050.
Very interesting. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think direct investment, as both Alistair and James have said, but I think I'd offer two more as well, where the private sector can play a big role, John, is one is in skills investment. So absolutely investing in the skills that we need. So through apprenticeships and upskilling people and understanding where that's going. I think that is something they can really, really do. And something we've not been great at sort of before, upskilling the workforce and getting ready. And I think that's an investment they can make now and will pay dividends later. And I think the second thing, Andrew, is so I've written down what I've called retained investment. So it goes on your issue about devolution a little bit and how it works in practice. So an understanding from businesses that are located in cities or towns that if you are going to do improvements to infrastructure and try and recoup that money through business rates or workplace parking levy or some sort of charging mechanism, that actually making the town and city a cleaner, nicer, more investable place, they have a role in paying for that and making it a sustainable system. Sometimes, not always, businesses do make it an objection to extra charging where they're located. But I think businesses and the private sector taking ownership of creating the places in which they are located and we want to be is something they could do to help move this more towards this overall net zero goal that we all need to get to.
Thanks. Well, John, can I just say thank you? That is a really interesting question, because we have to get to a place where the financial models promote investment and leverage in capital, either from individuals for their properties or for businesses or for investment opportunities to allow the bigger schemes to take place. I think the financial models have been quite a problem. That we've had well-meaning things such as green deals, whatever, indeed governments of all colours over quite a number of years have been struggling with this to make deals work, and they haven't effectively. But a critical point, and thank you for that question. Let me come now to Kate Martin-Cover, and then I'll go on from Kate to Lord Mayor after that, please. Kate, hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes.
Thank you for today's session. I'm a policy advisor at the CBI and the new infrastructure finance lead. And just following John's question about private investment, what we're working on at the CBI at this moment is, and also drawing on Andrew's point about financial models or financing models in infrastructure, we're trying to bring the different parties together, really the government, private investors and regulators. And one of our CSR asks to Treasury was actually to expand the role of the UK Infrastructure Bank to maximise private investment. So I'm wondering what the speaker's view on that is, and whether they believe that the UK Infrastructure Bank has the potential to achieve that and to truly bring those parties together. And just to flag, we're organising a roundtable event probably at the end of November on the infrastructure finance delivery models, and we're hoping to get some someone from Treasury to speak and have a direct conversation with our members on that. So yeah, just wanted to raise those 2 points. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate. I think perhaps James first on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So on the infrastructure bank, look, I mean, it's one of the things we caught for back in 2018. So we clearly think it's a good idea, but I think we've got to be realistic about its role in the funding and financing challenge for net zero. It's clearly should be there to address areas of market failure and to address issues of additionality. It shouldn't be crowding out private investment. It should be crowding in private investment and leveraging in private investment. That's its role, because let's be honest, it's got significant capital allocation, but the vast majority of money, going back to John's early question, that will be brought into these sectors to resolve the net zero transition is going to be sort of private investment dragged in by regulatory models. The infrastructure bank is going to play an important but sort of modest role in comparison. And I think we've got to see the infrastructure bank through that lens, rather than seeing it as the answer to all financing problems in UK infrastructure, which it clearly isn't. But I think it can play a very strong role, particularly in new technologies and nascent technologies, some of which I've talked about. It can bring a galvanizing role there and to sort of lever in private investment by taking on some of the sort of early stage risk, both on net zero, but also in the levelling up space as well. So I think it's got a very important role, but I think we've got to be realistic about what its scope and scale is versus the overall infrastructure investment challenge that we face.
Yeah, good point. It is all about crowding in. Right, Jonathan, if I could come to you. I'm just noticed we're getting a few more hands up. So after this, I'm going to come to Lord Mayor and then Jerome Frost. But Jonathan first, please.
Everything that James said, Andrew. But I think I'd add one more thing where I think the infrastructure bank can make a difference is the kickstart. So the trajectory to net zero, every year we delay or every year we prevaricate, the trajectory to net zero becomes more and more difficult. So there is a real role in the next decade to get ahead of the game in the where the 2030 trajectory is. And I think that's, as James said, where market failure and kick-starting projects and the idea of levelling up, the bank can play a real role there, because I think private sector support will come from momentum, and momentum is everything in this game. The countries that have done well on net zero and have got momentum, and I think that's where I think the bank can play a real role. Is getting us really kick-started on this.
Right, very good. if you would forgive me, Alistair, I'm not going to come to you on this question. I'm going to press on with some of the other questions. We've got people putting their hands up. So can I come next, please, to Lord Mayor Robert? Very good of you to be joining us again. Nice to see you. Over to you, please.
Hello, I just would like to ask the panel their views on the announcements yesterday about support for small modular reactors for the nuclear industry, and what you think that means in terms of the strategy for energy, and indeed what it means for infrastructure construction, because it potentially could be something that's going to be quite major, and I'd be interested in your views. Our House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology did an inquiry a few years ago on the nuclear industry, and we came out very strongly in favour of small modular reactors as something that the UK really could be leading on, with the kind of huge experience of Rolls-Royce and the nuclear submarines. But I'd like your views really as to where you think this puts us strategically in terms of net zero and infrastructure construction in the coming years.
Alistair first. I think it's a great question. Alistair first.
Well, it is a great question, and I'm really excited about small modular reactors. And I think actually, if you go back to where I came into this conversation right at the start, when I talked about delivering on the government's objectives, I think this is something that really does drive that, because it can help us deliver net zero. It can help deliver levelling up, and to an extent, it helps with the Get Brexit Done stuff, because it's something that we can theoretically sell around the world as a market leader. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. However, nothing in nuclear is easy. So heading in that direction, I think we need to be aware that the aspirations may be constrained by some of the challenges that we find as we get into that world. But I think the opportunity is so big and so positive that we shouldn't be afraid of it, but we should go into it with our eyes open as to where we think it's going to be. Probably isn't going to be exactly where we end up, but let's start on the journey.
Very interesting. For what it's worth, this actually is quite a topic of conversation in places like the Commons Tea Room. House of Commons, obviously, works with the Chamber and all the things that happen around the Chamber. This is one of those topics which is widely discussed around the Chamber. Jonathan, next, please, and then I'll come to James.
I think Alistair's right, and I think Lord Mayor, the committee was completely right as well. I think it has a definite place in the mix. It's back to what I said about momentum. The small modular reactors, in theory, can be delivered more quickly, more easily, and as Alistair said, spread around the country a little bit more in terms of the levelling up agenda, and therefore can make the start toward net zero and the momentum much more quicker. And as Alistair said, then I think it's something that the UK can then excel in. We've got a lot of things we can excel in terms of infrastructure. This is one of the opportunities to grab this and then move this technology around the world to be a part of market leader.
James.
Thank you. Look, this is a really interesting subject. I think it's fair to say that the Commission hasn't sort of done a lot of work in this space so far in terms of small or advanced modular reactors. But I think clearly, if developed, these could have a sort of valuable role to play in the energy system. However, I would say that clearly this technology has not yet been commercialised, so there is quite limited information to make decisions on. And so I think acting now to develop the option to deploy these reactors to support net zero is probably a prudent course of action. But I think we do need to face the challenge that SMRs have a dual challenge. They're both a first-of-a-kind project and they are a nuclear project. So I think delivery should not be rushed, would be my caution.
Right, thank you. Great question. I think we are going to have much more of a frank national discussion about power generation. I think the events of the last few weeks have made that abundantly clear. So thank you very much, Robert. Great question. I said to come to Jerome next. After Jerome Frost, I'll come to Kate Kenny. Jerome, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jerome from Arup, and thank you for a great conversation so far. I just wanted to return to the sort of place focus that we started around and devolution. And so drawing on some of the experience we've had in Arup in working on the Towns Fund programme, which is one of the government place-focused programmes at the moment, there are probably two big areas of success there. One is it's very much about local leadership, as a couple of speakers alluded to first, and government backing for that local leadership. And secondly, it is very business engaged, with local businesses getting on top of the plans for their area and covering multiple aspects of investment. The other piece that the government, I think, has done really well in that programme is recognise the importance of funding delivery experience, and actually putting in place Arup and many others, actually providing experience to local authorities who don't have the capabilities, don't necessarily have the right people in place to pull together quite sophisticated programmes across multiple sectors. And I think one of the opportunities perhaps that exists for this spending review is to recognise the importance of that, and the importance of that gives confidence to private sector investment. If you've got the right level of experience and thought and delivery capabilities applied to some of these ambitions, I think the flow of private investment is likely to be much more certain, and that's certainly the experience we're having. So I suppose my question to the panel is, do you see that coming through this review, and do you see it being a kind of explicitly recognised need, perhaps cutting across multiple funds rather than being attached, as it so often is in the past, to kind of individual projects or individual investment sectors?
Right, very good question. I think Alistair, perhaps first of all, and then Jonathan. Alistair.
So I'm not sure I've got a good answer on the second part of the question, but I'm going to lean on an early bit of the question, which was about having the expertise in order to deliver. It's probably, I don't know, 8 years since I was in front of the Communities and Local Government Committee talking about the need to provide what we at the time were calling flying squads, which would go in and provide support where local regional bodies were delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, and yet the individual councils had almost no capacity with which to do so. It doesn't feel like that agenda has moved forward very significantly since then. There is still this huge need to make sure that you're matching the competence to deliver with the funding that's available to do so, because otherwise I think there is a real risk that you start putting quite a lot of money into organisations that are not well placed to secure really good outcomes from that investment. So if I've understood the question correctly, I think that's one thing that we would be keen to see, is some support to make sure that that level of competence within delivery organisations matches the aspirations that are set for them. And that includes both councils and some of the sort of sub-regional boards. I think we've got to resource them appropriately.
Well, smooth move into Jonathan, though, with the TFN experience.
Yeah, thanks. So Jerome, I don't hold out much hope that it'll get mentioned in budget or CSR, but should it? Absolutely, absolutely. So, some regional transport bodies like Transport for the North, Transport for the South East, Midlands Connect play a fantastic role in bringing together some of the big requirements. And it's interesting that the TFN and Midlands Connect, develop their responses to the integrated rail plan within 2 or 3 months, and yet the plan itself has sat at government for over 12 months, really. So that's an indication of how quickly and how knowledgeable that capacity is, which is really, really important. I think we need to argue for it. James will probably mention that in the recent NIC report on towns, there was a very specific recommendation about providing that capacity. And I think you're right, that I think that there's a lot of experience in the Towns Fund and in some national transport bodies that we can take forward. That is something that should be fairly easy to do, and is a key part of the devolution argument, because you're right, Andrew, responsibility, accountability, but I think capacity is important to make devolution work. That there is a reason why Manchester's devolution is ahead of where everybody else is. That's because there's been a lot of people, and good people, working on the Manchester devolution agenda that were put in place way back in sort of the early 2000s. That similar sort of setup needs to be provided across the mayoral combined authorities, and as James and the NIC recommended, the towns as well, because our sort of towns provide a big part of the levelling up agenda, and they've been underplayed a little bit so far, but they have a big role to play going forward.
Thank you. Very interesting point. Having done some of the devolution deals as a Treasury Minister, I can confirm that things are quite different in different parts of the country, but no names beyond that point. James, over to you, please.
Yeah. Look, it's a very important point. Andrew, as you said, the variability in terms of local capacity and capabilities is quite stark in the UK. And I think, look, I would go as far as to say, if you want to level up economic outcomes in the UK, you have to level up capacity. I think you can do that in a couple of ways. I mean, you do it one way by changing the funding model, and rather than burning up local capacity with endless competitions, a more consolidated, simplified funding model should probably free up more resource for local leaders and local officials to focus on strategy development and strategy delivery. I think you need to do that. The second thing you need to do, which we also recommended in our recent report on towns regeneration, is look at how government can help build capacity and capability at the local level. And we made a proposal there about looking at using existing institutions to do that, both centre of expertise, sharing best practice, etc., etc. But I think you've got to do both things. I think you've got to sort the funding model out first, so you build local capacity, not burn it, but then also inject additional support into those areas that need it in terms of sort of revenue. But I think if you're going to get the levelling up agenda done, I think this is personally, from all the analysis we did and all the conversations we had, feels like a key part of the jigsaw. And I would hope it's something that the levelling up white paper, when it arrives, addresses.
Well, I strongly agree with what has been said. Thank you for that question, and to all the speakers. Let's come now to Kate Kenny. Now, Kate, you had your hand up, then I think it went down again. I'm not sure. Are you seeking to ask a question, Kate? If you are, please now say hello. I'm taking that as a no in that case. Right. In that case, can I go straight, therefore, to Naomi Baker? Naomi, hello. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'd be really interested in the panel's view on whether buildings should be formally classed as infrastructure. So in terms of why I'm asking this, we know from the Climate Change Committee that by 2050, the investment required to decarbonise the stock will be outweighed by the cumulative bill savings. So we know that on this macro level, there's a business case, but that doesn't necessarily apply for the commissioning homeowners. So I'd be really interested to hear your view on whether classing it as infrastructure would allow for more innovative financing. Thank you.
Right. Well, perhaps Alistair first up, and then James, then Jonathan.
So this is a really interesting one because it depends on whether I'm wearing my basically lobbyist hat for the infrastructure sector, where we're quite cozy around economic infrastructure being something that we can put a blanket over and we know what we're talking about. And then, so we always kind of try to resist scope creep as to what we mean about infrastructure, versus what I would describe as the absolute bloody obvious, which is, of course, buildings are part of the infrastructure. The infrastructure is the things that we have in society that we rely on in order to deliver our daily lives. And so I think that, yes, buildings are infrastructure. So I suppose the challenge back would be, what is the context in which we're describing buildings and infrastructure? Why is it important? So I suppose it really links back to what is the conversation you're having, and therefore why it's important for buildings to be classed as infrastructure. So particularly in relation to stuff like the carbon debate, obviously it is part of our national infrastructure, and we should treat it as a strategic priority for the UK to get carbon out of all parts of our infrastructure, including our building, our housing stock, and other buildings. So yeah, I'm trying to steer away from my natural instinct to be a lobbyist on this. So yeah, I think the answer is probably a guarded yes.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. Jonathan.
I wouldn't add much more to what Alistair just said. I think that theoretically, yes, absolutely. You know, if infrastructure is about the things we do, supporting the lives we lead, supporting the wealth we create, and our quality of life, then buildings are absolutely fundamentally part of that. And buildings generally can play a role in creating that place shape that we talked about. So I think that is something that if we articulate that, which we do, we have to accept they are part of the infrastructure that we create, and therefore should be looked to provide that net zero delivery that we talk about.
James.
I think I probably agree that I certainly do regard sort of buildings as infrastructure. I was just thinking through what reclassification might mean in practice, though, in terms of what financing and funding models might be available. Because I think we all agree that heat is probably, well, not probably, it is the single biggest net zero challenge. It's going to require a huge amount of money to fix it, and there's going to be some decisions made about how much is paid by consumers and households versus taxpayers, and therefore dealing with those upfront costs. Could you deal with those upfront costs? You can deal with them through grants, which the government have obviously announced yesterday. Could you deal with them through financing, which allows people to obviously to lend the money to make improvements in their properties through private mechanisms and then pay back, like we do in lots of other areas of our lives? Could that be a way of trying to solve this huge financing and funding question in buildings? So if that's what's behind the question, does this unlock some more interesting financing opportunities to deal with the upfront cost challenge, deal with some of these sort of problems we've got? Then I think it's quite an interesting thing to explore. But as I say, I've not definitively looked at it, but it seems an interesting area.
Thanks. Thank you, Naomi. I'm absolutely sure that we have a huge challenge in, as James just said, the biggest net zero challenge is how we heat our homes. And I think it's going to be the most difficult thing to achieve because we are dealing with so many homes of different types, of different ages, and different ownership models. You can see, I think, an easier path for decarbonising transport, even though it's not a smooth and a very expensive journey ahead. You can see that path. It's less clear, I think, in other areas, and heating homes is a very big challenge. I think we have to consider the built infrastructure, including homes, to be a part of the broader infrastructure questions that we have. Right, I have no more hands up, unless anybody has a last chance to do so. Ask your question. Now might be a good time to indicate. We've been talking for an hour or so, and I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. I think the key points for me have been about certainty, long-term, to allow people to develop confidence, to allow people to develop the appropriate skills. And I hope that we can finally break out of some of our stop-start approach to investment, which I think adds cost, reduces the public goodwill towards it. But one thing we have got to do is stop talking about infrastructure as inputs. We should be talking about what infrastructure delivers for us as outputs, such as Jonathan was mentioning, it will be easier to do business and travel between Leeds or Sheffield, or heating homes, or all the various other projects that we've been talking about. So this is engineering and infrastructure as solutions to very big, significant national problems, which make our national life and individual lives better. That, I think, is where we need to be. We nearly always slip into talking about inputs in politics, but really outputs is what people are looking for. And that's, I think, been very clear from the questions that we've had this morning. If we haven't got any other questions, and nobody has indicated, I'm just going to therefore bring the discussion to a close a little earlier. Can I thank Alistair, Jonathan, and James for their remarks and answering questions so clearly and openly, and thank everybody for joining this meeting of the APPGI. It is one of the most active of the groups in Parliament, and we will have a very active programme for next year too. We are currently working on that, but I can tell you now it will be very active. So thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at future meetings. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a good day.